Good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today as we discuss equitable public engagement strategies. It's exciting to see so many people interested in this topic. Today's session is intended to provide you with ideas and inspiration to incorporate equity into your public engagement strategy. As each community is different, there is no one-size-fits-all approach. So if you're looking how to figure out how to check the box on equity, this is not the session for you. We hope the stories we will share today will reinforce the importance of an equitable public engagement strategy and give you some tools as you discuss with clients, colleagues, and elected officials. Before we get started, we'll do some self-introductions. I'm Catherine Tellez, a principal with Fair & Peers in our Orlando office, and I have over 20 years of transportation planning experience, and I'll be moderating today's session. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Fair & Peers, we're a transportation planning and traffic engineering firm, and we've been involved in countless studies with a community engagement component. For some projects, we're often partnered with a community engagement specialty firm, and for other projects, we've led the engagement activities. We have seen a lot of things that work well and a lot of things that could be improved. We are also seeing equity as a core theme in many of our projects, especially at the engagement level. Today's panel includes 3 practicing planners with stories of incorporating equity into public engagement efforts. Before we hear their stories, I'll invite them to introduce themselves, starting with Beth.
Hi, so nice to be part of this. I'm Beth Alden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Hillsborough Metropolitan Planning Organization for Transportation, based in Tampa. And I have an amazing team of planners that has developed as their mission statement to create safe and inclusive mobility choices that promote respect and trust. Nice to be with you today.
Great, thanks, Beth. Scarlett?
Good afternoon, everybody. Scarlett Hammonds, and I am a Senior Project Manager with the Corradino Group. We're a planning consulting firm, and I'm stationed down in Miami area in our headquarters office, but we also have offices throughout Florida and throughout 5 other states. And I primarily work in South Florida in communities, working on many different types of planning projects. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And our last panelist, Caro?
Hi, everyone. My name is Caro Vera. I am a senior transportation planner at Fair & Peers based in our LA office. So I'll be giving you a perspective from the West Coast today. One thing to know about me is I lead the community engagement practice for the firm along with a few other colleagues.
Great, thank you so much. We'd also like to thank those who took some time in advance of today to let us know a little bit more about where you are on the public engagement scale and what specific questions you have today through our Mentimeter poll. The initial results of our first question are up on the screen, and we invite you all to go to menti.com on your computer or smartphone and enter the code 732317 to participate. In addition to knowing where you or your organization is on the engagement scale, we're interested in knowing what other questions you might have. So this is one way for you to provide us with some feedback. You can also use the question box through the Zoom feature. And so I will just, yes.
It seems that 2 people have said there's no audio.
Oh. All right, I'm not quite sure.
Hi there, so you can try joining your audio through the audio settings of the Zoom window and clicking on it through the system drop down there. If you have additional issues with audio, please feel free to reach out to fpc20@360livemedia.com and we will be happy to help you troubleshoot there. Thank you.
Great, so hopefully folks are able to get on, and I'm seeing some new poll results come through. So as we were preparing for this session, we noted how public engagement strategies have been evolving through the course of our careers. You know, midday or evening open houses typically do not yield feedback from a representative segment of the population and can often lead us to believe that we have planned for a great project only to feel blindsided at the Planning Commission or City Council hearing by community opposition from those not reached and included in the initial public outreach. Many in the community want to participate, but life's challenges can get in the way, including transportation to meetings, childcare, work, language barriers, and in some cases, a mistrust of government. We now have more tools at our disposal to conduct outreach in ways that do not require a huge investment of time and can be fun and can also help us get more equitable outcomes. So with this, the poll will remain open. We'd love for people to continue to provide us feedback throughout, and we will share the results at the end. But I am now going to hand things over to Caro.
Hi, everyone. So the title of my presentation today is The Road to Equitable Community Engagement in Los Angeles, and it sounds exactly as to what we're going to speak of today. Today, I'm going to walk you through the Los Angeles Vision Zero project and the many lives that it's lived under community engagement. Can you please go to the next slide? So as many of you may already know, Vision Zero in Los Angeles launched in 2015 under mayoral executive directive, and it has to do with preventing the loss of life at hands of traffic collisions that are fundamentally preventable. And our goal is to have zero traffic fatalities by 2025 through, of course, behavior change, engineering, education, and engagement. You can go to the next slide. And you can just go to the next slide after that. So what I'm going to introduce today is LADOT's community engagement strategy, which is called DICE. Some of you may have heard of it. It is called Dignity Infused Community Engagement. So Fair & Peers was lucky enough to be brought on to be the project consultant for this team in Los Angeles from 2019 to 2020. And so this was really an opportunity to redefine the way that LADOT conducts community engagement. I'm not too sure if many of you are familiar with Los Angeles, but when Vision Zero launched in early 2015, 2016, it ended up launching on areas of the West Side. If you're not familiar with the West Side of Los Angeles is historically more affluent and more white, and areas that are more affluent and have more resources have seen more investment over the decades. But areas like South Los Angeles, where I'm from, have not seen the same level of investment and also have the majority of the high injury network and some of the most dangerous streets in Los Angeles. And so a big critique of Vision Zero Los Angeles having launched on the West Side was that they weren't starting where there was the highest need. And what they were also seeing is that community residents on that part of Los Angeles weren't as interested in the investments and the street improvements that were coming to their corridors. So what you ended up seeing was massive backlash, campaigns against council members to recall them, plenty of lawsuits saying that we needed to get rid of these safety improvements because they were causing delays in getting people where they needed to go if they traveled by vehicles. And so from those lessons, LADOT really learned that they needed to redefine the way that they conducted community engagement and do it in a way where it's of course more collaborative, but you're bringing those community residents that may have opposition or may not even know about the project period with you from the beginning. And so our conceptualization of the DICE strategy is a planning process that intentionally and holistically incorporates the viewpoints, lived experiences, and perspectives of those most impacted by a planning project. It seeks to restore and atone for historic, systemic, and institutional injustices. Can we go to the next slide? Another extension of our definition is that a dignity-infused planning process, as I mentioned, involves community members in the process from the beginning. So we're weaving both the perspectives of community members and the technical planning practices and expertises that many of us in this transportation planning field into a project. Next slide. And so what the DICE strategy did was it brought together several different components and several different community members from all types of backgrounds into the team. And what I mean by that is that we hired any CBO that wanted to be involved in the community engagement practice. It didn't really matter if you had extensive history in the transportation planning field. Our client was just really excited that you wanted to be involved in the process, which typically when we work with CBOs, we are working with CBOs that have a track record of doing transportation planning and have a long-standing history with this field. But it was important that if we really wanted to redefine the way that this community engagement is done, we need to have as many different partners at the table as possible. This also included university fellows. So we hired graduate students and undergrads who are in the creative arts, of course, who are transportation planners. And we also had a historian on board who really played an important role in helping us understand the long-standing history of underinvestment in South Los Angeles, of the LA riots of '92, of the Watts Rebellion, and really helped us understand what context we were dealing with. Because if you go to South Los Angeles, many of the things that were burned down during the LA Rebellion are still looking how they looked to the day they were burned. There has not been sufficient investment in those communities. And so if we're going into a community and trying to establish solid relationships that are intentional, we need to be aware of those histories. And so that's the role that our social science fellow played. And of course, our creative arts fellow helped us really reimagine the ways that we do community engagement through the arts. And the arts are accessible to everyone. Kids love to play with the arts, and so it was a really great strategy to get folks involved. Another thing was visual communications. Fair and Pierce led the visual communication strategy for this project, and it was really about delivering high quality and high caliber visuals with accessible language and making sure that they're available in any language that's spoken on the corridor. One thing that our client was really interested in is making sure that the materials that were developed for South Los Angeles were of the highest caliber, were presented beautifully, and also still accessible. And of course, we hired a street team of 20 community members that we actually reached out to an organization called People Assisting the Homeless, and hired people who maybe were recently incarcerated, maybe had a record, were experiencing houselessness or unemployment for a long period of time. Because for us, if we're doing dignity-infused community engagement, this is a perfect opportunity to train up staff that otherwise would have barriers to employment. So that means that our team was dealing with things that are unprecedented. I think people in the transportation planning field don't always know how to interact with people who maybe have a history of unemployment or have mental health struggles. And all of those things became apparent as we moved through the process of the project, but were so integral because when you work with everyday community members, you need to be prepared for those things to happen. Next slide. And with that, if you want vulnerable communities at the table, you need to start with dignity. And that goes exactly back to what I just mentioned in terms of we didn't go to UCLA or to USC to hire street team members. We went to organizations that help those in need. And we were willing, I think LADOT, Fair and Peers, and our other project partners to train up those staff. And at the end of the day, they became Vision Zero advocates at the end of the day, and would talk to community residents and connect with them at a deeper level that we couldn't because we didn't live on that corridor. So people would see their neighbors and their neighbors would conduct our survey and then bring their other friends to do our survey. So hiring local community members is a community engagement strategy in itself because those members already have their built-in cohesive networks that come with trust. Next slide. And so a few lessons from Los Angeles. I have 2 slides of these, so please brace yourself. One of them is, as we've mentioned, involve community members in the planning process from the very beginning. Engage communities more than once. The comment table should not debut at the open house. So for this project, we ended up doing 30 continuous days of community engagement. Yes, 30, where we had sometimes events 3 times a day because we would do 2 peak hour events and a midday event. And we were really doing a community engagement marathon because we wanted to make sure that by the time someone got to our open house, they had been touched at least once by someone from our team. And they were informed by the project and informed enough that they were arriving to the open house to be able to give us their final opinion or their opinion of what they'd like to see. The man that you see on the right in the back is the council member. So we wanted to make sure that community members knew what they wanted so they could tell the council member at that meeting if they wanted the bicycle safety improvements and if they didn't. And in overwhelming, about 80% or more of residents wanted the safety improvements on the corridor. Another one is to meet residents where they are. So we would has 4 tables at 4 legs of an intersection during AM and PM peak hours, where you would talk to residents and partner with local street vendors or give out coffee in the mornings and just ask residents what they thought about upcoming safety improvements. And that's part of not making residents have to attend an open house during hours when they're not available, and that being the first touch point that you have. You're continuously engaging them so that they've seen your face, or at minimum know your project by the time that they get to the big open house. Start where there's the highest need. I think that was a big lesson from Los Angeles, that South Los Angeles had the biggest and most dangerous streets, the most amount of streets on the high entry network. So we need to start there. And of course, don't just engage with the loudest voices. Sometimes people's voices aren't at the table because our community engagement strategies are failing to get them there. And that's something that I think is a big takeaway for me as a transportation planning practitioner, and for all of us, that our strategies are the ones that need to get people to the table. We can't blame their lack of participation on them. That's actually on us, to be able to make sure that our events are accessible enough and inclusive enough that small children feel welcome at our events. Next slide. The next one, and I think this is especially important now that we're living during a pandemic and people's time is strapped, some people are out of work, and people are really looking for everyday resources, is to offer compensation to local attendees. Something that I've suggested since COVID-19 really hit the US is that people need grocery cards, right? People need Visa gift cards because they need to find resources to make ends meet for their family, right? We have record levels of unemployment in this country at the moment. So if people are kind enough and generous enough to give us their time, we should be compensating them, because that also shows that we value the knowledge and we value the experience that they bring to this meeting. And so what I mean by that is, of course, we're the transportation planning experts, but these folks are resident experts in their communities and are going to know where the most dangerous street is that did not pop up on our high injury network because people don't report it and they don't want to interact with the police, or like a bunch of undocumented community members live there and there's underreporting. So it's really important to value the knowledge that our community residents bring to the table. Another thing, and all of these, I think, are really me adjusting to COVID-19 and trying to think of what are ways that we have a most cohesive and accessible engagement strategy possible. Evaluate your community engagement tactics and respond accordingly. After every single event that you have, I think now and moving forward, you need to evaluate who attended. Ask them if they felt included. Did they feel like they were listened to? Did they feel like they were informed? And you can do that via Mentimeter, or really just asking them to answer in the comment box. There's an array of ways to do that. And if you find that your population of attendees is monolithic, then you need to adjust your strategy. What I mean by that is you can pull the demographics of a community and know that maybe it's 85% Latinx, and if you get to your meeting and it's like 85% white, then you know that something didn't match up, and you're going to need to alter your strategy a little bit more in the future to make sure that your attendees are representative of the existing population in that community. Reach out and partner with local networks. Community-based organizations are really impacted right now. So if we are partnering with them, it's important that we also offer compensation for their labor and partner with them equally to really reach residents that we'd like to hear from. And the final one is, of course, to consider non-digital engagement strategies as in accompanying your digital strategies. So that can look like mailers, that can look like phone calls or phone office hours, but we really need to consider non-digital engagement strategies, as we all are, and many of our community members are experiencing the digital divide. The digital divide is not something that I heard our field talk about too much before the pandemic, but it's become a glaring lesson, I think, for us today, and is something extremely important that we need to think of as we conduct community engagement moving forward. Thank you so much.
Great. Thanks, Caro. That was great. I'm now going to hand things over to Scarlett to share some lessons learned in South Florida.
Thank you. That was really great. I found that very interesting. I'm going to talk a little bit about some lessons learned on some projects and integrating technology. Can you put the next slide? Um, so in my experience in planning, I've been a planner for about 25 years. We have worked on many different public outreach projects over the years to get public involvement. And we found that in the very beginning, we like to go ahead and tailor our public outreach efforts to what the needs are of the community, what the project needs, and of what the client needs. You know, big cities and small cities are not going to have the same players, the same characters, or the same types of needs. For example, when we worked on a project in for the city of Fort Lauderdale, the comprehensive plan update, it was important to meet with a number of neighborhood associations, special committees to deal with the special topics that were needed, and also board meetings, in addition to just meeting with the normal comprehensive plan outreach with the local officials. A project I worked on a couple years ago had to do with a onboard passenger survey actually a Haitian immigrant community here in Miami. Our survey was to hand out the surveys to the riders, and they would complete them on the bus and then hand them back. Knowing that it was a heavy immigrant community, we prepared our surveys in a number of different languages, in Spanish, English, and Creole. We thought, you know, we were ready to for the surveys, and so we thought we were doing great in the beginning until one of our surveyors who spoke Creole, it was her shift, and we realized that the results that she got when she interacted with the riders were so much more. It was double or even triple the number of surveys that we had success with the riders, because she was really able to reach out and engage them and break that language barrier that some of the other surveyors were experiencing. There wasn't that real personal outreach or touch, and they were a little bit hesitant to take the survey. So that was one lesson learned, that when we had a surveyor who could engage, we had much better results. In addition, some of the issues we faced were some people didn't want to take the survey because they had vision issues or illiteracy. And so we quickly pivoted on those types of survey takers, and we were able to do verbal interviews. In hindsight, I think we could have come a little bit more prepared with preparing for a verbal interview situation, but we were able to still gather plenty of information and pivot just right on the, as we needed to by doing some verbal interviews as we went through. Another issue that we had was not engaging the bus drivers early on enough. We didn't realize it until a few days into the survey that some of the bus drivers were telling the riders not to take our surveys. So that was a barrier that we found, you know, as we moved through, and overcame that by changing our tactics to talk with the bus drivers, let them understand what our survey was about and how that would help them in the future. Okay, I have the next slide. So other ways that we're integrating into our the new way of doing things, integrating technology into some of our public outreach efforts. We have Corradino created a Vera Voice crowdsourcing online software to engage in a number of different projects. We haven't, this is pretty new. We haven't really had the chance to use this on a lot of projects, so I don't have a lot of experience with this to tell you, but we're very excited about it. And we know that it's going to be very beneficial to our projects as we move forward. One of the reasons is that it's customizable to any issue that we need to deal with, and many different projects that we can use it for. And it also is, we can use it repeatedly. If we're finding that we're just not getting that right demographic, or missing out in certain geographic areas for input, then we can retool and relaunch the software and use it as many times as needed. And we find that's going to be a very valuable tool. Another way to integrate technology is that we had a project where we were going to do we had scheduled to do an actual field walking tour, but we had to pivot and change it to a virtual walking tour. And we did that by utilizing drone technology and a virtual meeting situation. So this was actually found to be a very successful effort. The background noise and the interference that you could normally have in a walking situation in a city street with cars and buses and all the background noise was completely eliminated. Therefore, the communication factor went up tremendously. People were able to comment and everybody was heard. You also didn't have people walking away from a group and not being able to participate, as a group. So that turned out to be very, very successful, and we would definitely do that again and recommend that. Catherine, that concludes my public participation experience. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Scarlett. Now that we've heard a few stories from the consulting side, I'm going to hand it over to Beth to share some stories from the public agency perspective.
Thank you again for the invitation to participate in this. I'm really enjoying learning from our other speakers. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what's been going on in Tampa. So next slide, please. And I'm going to start by talking about the Jemez principles for democratic organizing, because it's one way of thinking about how do we engage with others in a place of respect. Right, so we want to start all of our public engagement efforts with, I'm here not just representing my organization, but I'm also here as a human being relating to another human being. And what was great, I thought, about the Jemez principles, these were developed by a group of community organizers who came together. And one of the things that they talked about was mutuality and supporting each other's work. So we can think of it as, if I'm coming into this community, I'm asking this community to consider making a change. Maybe the person that I'm interacting with is also trying to make changes in this community. They might be here because they are active in their local church, or they are working on putting together a community garden, or they might organize, groups of moms that take care of each other's kids. So how can we support each other's work as we all look to make our community better? And the last point is also extremely important, that we are looking not only outwards, but also at ourselves and being willing to consider self-transformation through this whole process of interacting and engaging with the folks in our community. So next slide, please. A few of you asked in the polling questions in advance about how do we make the case for investing in equitable community engagement strategies. And one way to make the case is to talk about what happens sometimes when you don't do that. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of something that happened in Tampa, and then how it finally got turned around. So what you're seeing here on the screen is I-275 under construction a number of decades ago through the center of Tampa. It did destroy a historically African-American business district and cut many neighborhoods apart. And although that was decades ago, it's created not only a huge scar in the landscape, but also a scar in people's memories. So there was a proposal a few years ago to add express lanes through the center of Tampa on the interstate highway system and greatly expand the downtown interchange. So the interchange right next to downtown Tampa. And it took the neighborhood residents coming out and pointing out that this was not a blank slate. So this was a proposal Total parcels impacted 369. As of last year, there were still 336 residential relocations remaining to happen. So this is just to show that it was a big impact. Next slide, please. And the reaction from the community. This is a photograph of our public hearing for our transportation improvement program back in 2016. We had more than 500 people come out to that public hearing, and many spoke in opposition to the interstate expansion project. So next slide, please. It was at that point, it was later that year actually, that the Florida DOT decided to put the project on pause. So what they said was they were hitting the reset button. They developed a plan for robust community engagement. This reset did add years and millions of dollars to the process of coming up with a buildable project on I-275. Next slide, please. Florida DOT, and go ahead and advance that one more time. Florida DOT did a tremendous amount of work to do more robust community engagement. Oh, I'm sorry, there was something on that last slide that I wanted to show and it just didn't appear. So the last slide was photographs of bus tours where the Florida DOT actually hired local community members to give bus tours to their transportation engineers so that they would better understand the communities that they were building in. They started providing this level of transparency that you see here, of showing what kinds of comments that they were receiving from the public. Next slide, please. And they started being very specific about how they were responding to those public comments. And these are slides that they presented. So you talked, we listened, input leads to action. So they came up with some alternate concepts for the downtown interchange that reduced the footprint. They removed express lanes from consideration on I-275 north of downtown. They kept them in other parts, but removed them through that that historic district that you saw in the first photograph. And they also started doing some other things that people had been complaining about for years. So good neighbor safety checks on property that the DOT had owned, like boarded up houses that had just been standing vacant in these neighborhoods for years, owned by the DOT. And so they started addressing that. Next slide, please. They also heard about the importance of public transit, and they started figuring out, how can they invest in transit and walk bike improvements through some of these neighborhoods to improve connectivity. Next slide, please. And they created a new workforce development program. Again, this was, specifically responding to some of the comments that they were receiving from the public. Well, so it was a huge amount of effort, as you can imagine, and there were other things as well. Next slide, please. The decision about exactly what to do with the downtown interchange had not been made by the time that my MPO was due to adopt a long-range transportation plan update. So that was last November. And we were coming up on the time when we needed to finalize the plan document and going to FDOT and saying, okay, so what's the decision here on where to go? And they didn't really have a decision for us. And so we suggested, we're going to be doing public engagement. How about if we specifically ask about the downtown interchange options in the public outreach that we're going to be doing for this plan update? And to their credit, Florida DOT said, yes, go ahead and do that. And so this is kind of top rung of Arnstein's ladder of public participation. They're delegating some of the decision making to citizens. through this public engagement effort, that they didn't even control the survey mechanism. Next slide, please. So I'm going to show you a little bit about what that looked like. Next slide, please. We normally do our largest public engagement efforts around our long-range transportation plan update. And so we had a little bit of a budget for it, not nearly as much as DOT had for the Tampa Bay Next Express Lanes program. So we were trying to be frugal. Our idea was to have one short survey that is distributed through as many different outlets and formats as possible. So it was on a website, of course, promoted the link electronically in many, many ways, took it out to community groups. We did audience polling. We rode buses and brought iPads with us. We had a hard copy version of this survey for folks who didn't want to use electronic devices. Next slide, please. And this is the screen that shows the 4 different options that we presented for the downtown interchange. So for each option, there was a brief list of bullet points of what that option meant. And then everyone got to rate that option on a 1-star to 5-star scale so that we could be kind of nuanced about this. And the options that we provided were kind of simplified versions of what DOT was showing in their environmental impact study options. So we were trying to translate this into plain English, use photographs, be very brief. We were providing this in a format that people could respond on their cell phones. So the text can't be too long. It has to be, short enough that you can see it on the cell phone. So really a lot went into digesting the 4 options into something that could be manageable and easily understood. So next slide, please. And then we just brought this out, as I mentioned, and promoted it in as many different ways as we could think of. So we did take it out to meetings of community groups and to events that community groups were holding, where we would set up an information table and allow people to respond to the survey right there. Reached out to 20 community groups who helped spread the word about the survey. Rode on the bus, I think I mentioned that. So we had more than 600 surveys that were completed through our outreach events. That's just through the events. And this map shows how that we were tracking, are we making sure that we are going to some events in communities that have been underrepresented in the decision-making process in the past. So next slide, please. A couple of things that we learned through this process. One is that we spent a lot of time coordinating with community leaders. You have to build in time to do that. So it's a lower cost strategy, but you need to be planning for it like 6 months in advance, mapping out what are the communities that you need to reach, figuring out who are the contacts, how do you reach them, when are they meeting regularly, what means do they use to communicate with their group members, and so forth. So leave yourself plenty of time. Next slide, please. And this just shows some of the mapping that we had done of our communities of concern. This is not the mapping that we use to make sure that we are meeting the executive order on environmental justice. So that's more targeted. But with our communities of concern, we are casting a broad net and trying to make sure that we understand the different characteristics of the people who are part of our community. Next slide, please. So we got a huge response on this survey. More than 5,000 people ultimately answered it. One of the other parts of that success was low-cost ad buys on social media. So next slide, please. This was actually one of them. That's why I blew that photograph up. That was actually one of our ads that we used on Twitter. The great thing about social media ad buys is they're not very expensive. The other great thing about them is that they send out the link to an online survey directly. So as soon as people are receiving the ad, they can click on it and they can go straight to the survey. That's different, of course, than like radio advertising, where you have to rely on people to follow up themselves later. So one lesson learned from our ad buys is start small, start with some small ad buys, see what the response is, adjust. You can adjust the images, you can adjust which zip codes you're targeting, and so forth. Next slide, please. So we were real pleased with how this worked out. Our ads did target zip codes with underrepresented groups. This again is one of the ads on Twitter. And compared to a similar survey that we did back in 2014, the participation from African Americans increased 40%, and the participation by Hispanic persons increased 70%. Next slide, please. Just a couple of things to keep in mind if you are using social media as part of a diverse outreach strategy. So like everything else, it's one piece, it's one tool in your toolbox. It doesn't replace other forms of outreach. And it's important to be aware that different demographic groups use platforms differently. So far, less use by Hispanic demographic groups in general. African Americans more likely to use Twitter than Facebook. Younger age groups more likely to use YouTube and Instagram. And low income and rural households are less likely to use data consumptive media like Facebook Live or YouTube. So next slide, please. You can find demographics on most of your social media platforms. So Facebook tends to skew more educated and more senior citizens, if I remember right, as opposed to like YouTube, which might skew younger. So next slide, please. And then one kind of last note on the demographics. So digital divide, something we're continuing to talk about. While virtual meetings have helped provide access to people who have transportation challenges, they do present issues for folks who maybe don't have access to a smartphone, maybe aren't as computer savvy. And one thing to keep in mind here is that even though lower income households often do have a smartphone because they need it for a variety of essential services, they might have limited data usage. So anything that relies on streaming, like a meeting like this, for example, is going to limit their ability to participate. So to the extent that you can give them something static to react to, they'll be more able to do that using their smartphone. Abilities and disabilities are also something to keep in mind. So while physical barriers may be less challenging for folks with mobility impairments, for folks with hearing impairments or visual impairments, we need to be thinking about some other things, obviously, in our virtual outreach strategies. So next slide, please. And I'm gonna wrap this up. So how did that interchange project ultimately turn out in our survey? So again, we had 4 scenarios. This is a map of the level of support in our different zip codes. And so the dark blue is folks who gave that option a low rating, and the deep gold is folks who gave that option a high rating. You can see that the no build strategy was not well supported by folks all around the county. The express lane and full rebuild options were supported by folks in the outlying areas and opposed by folks living in the center. And the safety and traffic quick fix had support or neutral feelings from folks all over the county. There is, one zip code that kind of opposed it up in the northeast corner of the county, That's one of our least populated areas. It's the home of a major state park. And so what we saw here was that there was actually support from the neighborhoods that live next to that interchange. And ultimately that became the locally preferred alternative recommended by Florida DOT. And we adopted that into our long-range transportation plan. And that is it for me. Thank you again.
Great. Thanks so much, Beth. That was a great presentation there. So I'm going to go back to our Mentimeter polls. So for those who joined late, we wanted to just get a sense of where folks on the call today are on the public engagement scale. And then we're also using this to collect questions that folks might have. Also, feel free to submit questions through into the chat box as well. So I'm going to share what some of the initial questions are. Some really great questions coming in. I don't think we'll have a chance to get to all of them, but I do have a few that I think we can touch upon. So one that struck my interest here was how to increase consulting firm and municipal planning staff racial and cultural diversity. And that's a fantastic question. And I think that really starts at the middle school level of letting folks know that careers in planning and engineering exist, and really helping to support folks through their educational journey, and then recruiting folks to make sure that you do have a diverse workforce that represents the communities that you do serve. So at Fair and Peers, we've actually started doing some outreach at a number of high schools and even middle schools in our local areas, just to try and let people know that a career like this exists. I actually didn't find out about planning until my senior year in college. So it's one of those things that folks don't, grow up thinking, oh, I want to be a planner. So let's inspire them and get folks sort of through the pipeline so we can hire them. Other panelists, if you care to add some perspective there.
Yeah, most definitely. I think what you mentioned about education plays a role, but as there are national conversations on white supremacy and anti-Blackness, I also think it's important for both consulting firms and city agencies and county agencies to really interrogate the ways in which their organizations have maybe a white supremacist culture. And what I mean by that is notions of cultural fit. There's research that finds that looking for cultural fit, if your organization is already maybe largely white and male, means that people are going to be looking for folks who look like them or who have similar mannerisms as them. And so notions of cultural fit, I think, really need to be assessed at all of our organizations. I also think this is a perfect opportunity, if possible, to hire a racial equity consultant. I don't think that the public or even just our staff expect us to be experts in our own right, but they do expect us to find the good resources to make sure that our organizations are reflecting these values. Because another thing is, once you get these diverse staff at the door, retention is equally important. If not, you're just going to have a cycle of people leaving your firm or organization. So it's also about how you retain those staff. Do you equitably invest in your staff of color? And what I mean by that is that if you have a streak of solely hiring and promoting white staff, how are you investing in the leadership and professional development of your staff of color? And I'm really proud to say that that's something that Fair and Peers does. There's been a lot of investment in my professional development and my ability to rise at the organization. But as a planner of color, those are things that if I were to be on the job market, I would be looking for how an organization is going to invest in me, and know that they should have enough knowledge at this point that that is equally important, because there have been protests and uprising for most of this year. In South Los Angeles, we've had them for a few weeks because a bicyclist was murdered by the sheriffs. So I think it's also a big responsibility on our organizations, how we retain these staff, but also assessing the ways in which we recruit them, because we can still hold exclusionary practices within that, even when trying to look for staff of color.
Great, thanks for that, Caro. Beth?
Just wanted to add something really quickly. Those are all great points. the planning, the population of folks with planning degrees has a lower percent of Black and brown people than the population in general. And so one of our challenges has been finding candidates with planning degrees. And so as we've, you know, really spent some time recently kind of grappling with this, you know, what we're doing is casting a wider net. Honestly, we're reaching out to department heads at other universities, historically minority universities, and they don't necessarily have planning programs there, but they might have other things. They might have social sciences or anthropology or public administration, and asking them to promote our job postings to their graduates.
Great, thanks for that. Another question I found really intriguing was sort of educating public sector clients on the downside and really how to start that conversation. And we have an example of a Caltrans safety project where we just went ahead and did some equity mapping. We had the census data and other pieces of data available. It really only took us a few extra hours to add some additional layers and nuance to the analysis that we are already doing. And we then presented it to the client. So it wasn't something that they had asked for. And we knew if we asked for permission, they would say, oh no, we don't need that. Let's just, you know, do it the way that we have always been doing it. But fortunately, the client had an open mind, and once they saw it, they were like, wow, that is just, you know, sort of mind-blowing. They had no idea that so many of the pedestrian fatalities were occurring in communities of concern. And they took that information and they actually used that as part of the prioritization process to make sure that improvements were being prioritized in communities that you know, had the largest racial inequities. Let's see, others want to add to that?
Yeah, another aspect of it is that just from a financial or just risk perspective, the risk of not conducting engagement well and having severe backlash that actually stunts your project or even prevents it from going into implementation, particularly when there are safety concerns that you're trying to address, does cost the organization in the long term potentially a lot more money than if you were able to do engagement in a way that was inclusive or brought as many people to the table in the beginning. And what I mean by that is if you're asked to go back by maybe a council member or even just for me, like a DOT or a Metro staffer, and do community engagement again, those are resources that could have been used from the very beginning to be invested in an equitable and accessible engagement strategy. So it's actually more risk averse to create a cohesive and well thought out and strategic engagement strategy from the very beginning than to have to go back and backpedal to address things that maybe were blind spots in the engagement process from before you started. I think I saw something pop up. Oh, maybe not.
All right, and looking through some of the questions here, there seems to be a theme around budgeting appropriately for a robust public engagement process. And the project that Caro described had a very large budget because it was a very large community engagement effort. And Beth's project, I'm pretty sure, had a lot of staff hours assigned to it as well. So I really look at it more in terms of what's the cost of not doing a robust community engagement process, especially for large infrastructure projects that have the potential to really change the fabric of the community. But I think a lot of it begins in having conversations with your clients and being realistic about what you can and cannot do with the funds that are available, and really being clear about setting specific goals that you want to achieve through the community engagement process, and even having a little bit of flexibility in the budget so that if you're halfway through the project and you see that you're not getting the feedback that you want, you can pivot a little bit to make sure that you're doing some additional outreach to reach those folks. But really a good community engagement process should not be an afterthought on a project. And I know that Beth and others have some great insight to share as well.
Yeah, I'll add just real quick that I would, repeat what you said a little bit, but that's really one of the most important things is to come up with a good plan to begin with, and one that is really tailored to the community, to the efforts, and that includes the budget. So that's something that should be definitely worked out in the very beginning of a project, and so that you've got the right fit.
One thing that I would suggest to consultant groups is that as you're developing a scope for a public agency, maybe you're asking them about what social media platforms are they using right now, so that you're integrating the messaging into their regular business practice. And so you can maybe, leverage whatever infrastructure agency already has in place to get your outreach accomplished.
Great, thanks for that. Let's see, I'm intrigued by the question on engaging primarily Hispanic communities that don't typically participate in government processes. And I think maybe part of the subtext here is a distrust of government. And I think it might also tie in other communities where we see survey fatigue and people are constantly being surveyed, but then nothing ever happens. So really, what are some strategies to help gain the trust of the community? And then is there a process to provide feedback to that community in terms of what actually happened with their feedback? How was it used?
Yeah, I can add to this one. There's a few things, but it also goes back to what I mentioned during the presentation, that it is fundamentally our responsibility to get these folks to the table. And if they're not at the table, then maybe the strategies that we're using aren't working that well. But there's a few things that you can do. I also think that hiring people who look like the community members that you're serving is important if that's not already happening. And that can look like partnering with local community-based organizations or nonprofits in your area and bringing them on as equal project partners. Because what that does is, if that local organization is showing trust in your MPO or your Department of Transportation, that means that those community members that trust that nonprofit know that your government organization has already been vetted. And so that's one small way to build trust from community members, because oftentimes nonprofit organizations have a base of residents that they work with or that they organize with to win campaigns or to just advance social justice causes. Another thing is to make sure that you're having events at times of day that work for people. And especially now with, as I mentioned, the digital divide, I think it does get a bit more difficult, but think of incentives or ways that you can reach those residents that will also bring them to the table. So another thing to consider is that if people don't have access to internet, what are engagement events that you can have that don't require internet access, right? Does that mean that you will send home a massive mailer that says, if you respond to my survey, it depends on your budget. Imagine you have a great budget and everyone can win something, which is not always realistic. Or you can randomize incentive options. And then from there, from that mailer, you can have the option of, we'll also have office hours, or we also have this website, which again, I think doesn't work if they don't have internet access, but sometimes people have it on their phone. And invite them to like a phone town hall where they can learn about a project. And especially if you're partnering with a local organization that will either co-facilitate or fully facilitate that phone town hall, I also think that takes the pressure off of our organizations to have to do that labor. If maybe you don't have in-house managed translation, or you don't have in-house people who can facilitate these conversations in maybe ways that are in layman terms or accessible to all. Those are a few strategies. Trying to think of a few. Target local radio stations that those residents listen to. That would be Spanish-speaking radio stations, target Spanish-speaking newspapers in the area. And even if you want to go the social media route, there's sometimes locally there's like big Spanish or just culturally relevant to that community Instagram pages. You can pay them for promo for your project. So there's creative ways to get at it.
Great, thanks so much. And I think we're at our time. So I've put up our contact information here on the screen. This was a great conversation. I wish we had more time to keep it going. I do appreciate all of our panelists for your time today and your expertise. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope that everybody else on the line took something away from this as well. So thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your conference.